I have previously shared the stories of America's first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, and today, I will continue by guiding you through my own life, through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps you are familiar with my connection to the Declaration of Independence and my role as the third President of the United States. But my story did not begin with these illustrious moments. It began in a quiet land and within a family deeply rooted in the value of education. My home, Virginia, is the foundation of my life. Its mountains and rivers nourished me, and in time, helped me understand the deeper meanings of liberty, equality, and independence. That I was born on April 13th, 1743, in Shadwell, Virginia, a place that no longer exists today. But in my memories, it will always be my starting point. I was born into a family of landowners. My father, Peter Jefferson, was a prominent plantation owner in Virginia. Although his name may not be widely remembered in history, he was the first true mentor of my life. He not only taught me how to manage land, but also showed me, by example, how to take responsibility for one's actions. That my father was a practical and visionary man. He not only provided us with a comfortable life, but also instilled in me a sense of discipline and resilience. He was an idealist who believed that knowledge was the key to changing one's destiny and that wealth was merely a tool. From a young age, he taught me that being a person of wisdom was the highest pursuit. His education wasn't limited to simply teaching me to manage the estate. He would take me out to prune the orchard, build a new home, and even at night, he would explain astronomy and natural science, letting me learn to think while working. His approach to education shaped me as a practical thinker and taught me to observe and understand the world around me. Our family library was small but well-stocked, with books on philosophy, history, and the sciences. Those books became my companions, and the works of ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, as well as contemporary Enlightenment thinkers, nurtured my growing mind. My mother, Jane Randolph, came from a well-established family in Virginia. While she came from wealth, her attitude toward life was humble. She was gentle, rational, and always faced life with composure. Her teachings instilled in me the true meaning of grace and wisdom. She often reminded me that being a member of the gentry was not just about wealth and status, but about having a sense of responsibility to society and a respect for others. My education began at home. Although my father was busy, he never neglected my schooling. He personally taught me everything from the basics of reading and writing to more advanced subjects like philosophy and natural science. We also had a small but rich library in our home, and he encouraged me to read everything from classical works to the latest scientific discoveries. These books expanded my horizons and taught me that the world was far larger and more complex than the farm and the mountains I could see. As I grew older, I attended the College of William and Mary, located in Williamsburg, Virginia. While not an elite institution by modern standards, it gave me an opportunity to expand my knowledge. There, I studied law, history, and ethics, and it was during this time that I began to understand the philosophical foundations of government. The writings of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu deeply influenced my understanding of government, liberty, and democracy. The academic environment at William and Mary played a significant role in shaping my worldview and values. I began to recognize that personal liberty and individual rights were the cornerstones of human society, and that every individual should have the right to pursue happiness and self-fulfillment. These ideas later became central to my political philosophy as I became more involved in the struggle for independence and the founding of a new nation. In addition to formal education, my upbringing was filled with the warmth of family life. Though my parents were both quite busy, we remained close-knit, and I had a strong bond with my siblings. We often gathered in the evening around the hearth, discussing our days and sharing our thoughts and dreams for the future. My father's steadfastness, my mother's wisdom, and the support of my siblings all helped me grow into someone who could face challenges with calm and reason. Shadwell was not just the place of my birth. It represented the beginning of my journey. It was here that I received my first lessons in responsibility, knowledge, and leadership. The books I read, the lessons my parents imparted, and the land I grew up on all played a crucial role in shaping my future. Although I did not yet know it at the time, I was being prepared for a life that would intersect with the history of America. My family provided the foundation I needed, and the ideas that began to take root in my mind here would one day guide me as I took on the responsibility of leading a new nation. Next, I will take you through my adolescent years, when I began to face greater challenges, and when my thoughts and ideas started to take shape as I prepared for the political path that would define my future. As I move forward in recounting my life, I want to take you to a pivotal time of intellectual awakening and self-discovery, a time when the seeds of my political philosophy were firmly planted. After my early education at home in Shadwell, I left the familiar comfort of my family and set out for Williamsburg, Virginia, in 1760 to attend the College of William and Mary. This marked a significant transition in my life, for it was here that I encountered a more rigorous academic environment and began to immerse myself in ideas that would not only shape my understanding of the world, but would also chart my course toward leadership. The years I spent at William and Mary were a period of intellectual growth and enlightenment. It was during this time that I came into contact with new ideas that would later serve as the foundation of my political beliefs and the driving force behind my role in the American Revolution. My mind was open to the revolutionary principles of liberty, justice, and equality, and it was here that I first realized the power of knowledge to change not only the individual, but the course of history. In 1760, at the age of 17, I arrived at the College of William and Mary. At the time, it was the second oldest institution of higher learning in the American colonies, founded in 1693. Although it was not as well known or prestigious as the universities in Europe, it was nevertheless a place where I could explore my intellectual curiosity. The college had a somewhat informal structure, with students taking courses in a variety of subjects, and it encouraged self-directed learning, a perfect environment for a young, eager mind like mine. I initially enrolled with the intention of studying law, but my academic interests were far-reaching. I found myself drawn to many areas of study, including philosophy, natural sciences, and history. Among the most influential of my professors was George Wythe, who taught law at the college. Wythe was a man of great intellect and a dedicated student of the Enlightenment. He instilled in me the importance of law not only as a profession, but as a moral endeavor. He taught me that the law should serve the people, protect their rights, and reflect a higher moral order, rather than simply maintaining the status quo. At William and Mary, I encountered the writings of the great Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and others, who had a profound influence on my understanding of government, liberty, and the rights of individuals. Locke's theories on natural rights and the social contract were particularly compelling. He argued that individuals are born with certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and property, and that governments are formed to protect these rights. This was a radical departure from the prevailing belief in the divine right of kings, and it spoke directly to the injustices I saw in the world around me. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws introduced me to the idea of the separation of powers in government, a concept that would later become a cornerstone of the American system of government. Rousseau's The Social Contract provided me with a deeper understanding of the relationship between the individual and the state, and it further shaped my beliefs about the necessity of a government based on the will of the people. As I absorbed these Enlightenment ideas, I began to see the flaws in the existing system of governance in the colonies. The British government, under King George III, was increasingly imposing taxes and laws on the colonies without their consent, a situation that I found intolerable. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the Intolerable Acts were among the many unjust measures that had begun to rouse the colonies to action. I felt that it was not enough to merely read about these injustices. It was time to act, to take a stand for the rights of individuals and for the cause of liberty. While at William and Mary, I was not yet fully involved in the political struggles of the day, but I became increasingly aware of the growing tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain. In 1765, at the age of 22, I began to engage more actively with the political climate. The Stamp Act, which imposed taxes on paper goods in the colonies, was one of the first acts of the British government that caused widespread outrage. It was clear to me that this was not just an economic issue. It was a matter of principle. The British government had no right to tax the colonies without their consent. I joined the growing chorus of protest against the Stamp Act, aligning myself with those who believed that the colonies had the right to govern themselves. This was my first taste of political activism, and it set the stage for my later involvement in the broader movement for independence. I became increasingly involved in discussions about the role of government, the nature of tyranny, and the rights of the people. These debates were not confined to the walls of William and Mary. They were taking place in the streets and in the homes of the colonists. As I listened to these discussions and took part in them, I realized that my intellectual curiosity could no longer be limited to the classroom. I was being called to action. In 1767, when I was 24 years old, I was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, marking my official entry into the political arena. The House of Burgesses was the colonial legislature of Virginia, and it was here that I would first put my developing political beliefs into practice. The events that followed would define my future and set me on the path to become a leader in the American Revolution. Although my political interests were growing, my intellectual curiosity never ceased. I continued to study law, history, philosophy, and science. I developed a deep interest in architecture, particularly classical architecture, which I believed represented the highest ideals of order and beauty. I began designing and planning my home, Monticello, drawing on the principles of classical design and the symmetry I found so inspiring. This passion for architecture would later shape my vision for public buildings and the layout of Washington, D.C. During this time, I also became more focused on the importance of education. I believed that education was the key to improving both the individual and society as a whole. This conviction would later lead me to establish the University of Virginia, an institution where students could receive an education free from the influence of religious dogma and guided by the principles of reason and inquiry. My years at the College of William and Mary were transformative. They were the years when I came into contact with the great ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas that would shape my understanding of government and liberty. I began to see clearly that the cause of liberty was not just an academic pursuit for me. It was a personal calling. The injustices I saw around me, the oppression imposed by a distant government, demanded that I act. It was during this time that I committed myself to the idea of self-governance, the protection of individual rights, and the creation of a just society. When I left Williamsburg and returned to Virginia, I was no longer just a young man with intellectual ideals. I was someone with a mission. The ideas I had embraced at William and Mary would guide me in my later political endeavors, and they would help shape the future of a nation that was beginning to awaken to the idea of freedom. The foundation had been laid, and my role in the coming revolution was now becoming clear. Next, I will take you through my early political career, where my ideas began to take form in the struggle for American independence and the creation of a new government, a government based on the principles I had spent my youth studying. As I look back on my early political career, I realize it was in these formative years that the ideals I had studied and cherished during my time at the College of William and Mary were tested in the crucible of political action. The revolution was no longer a distant theoretical discussion, but a tangible movement, one that required both intellectual and moral courage. From my early experiences in the Virginia House of Burgesses to my involvement in the Continental Congress, my journey was defined by a gradual realization that my destiny was bound to the fate of the American colonies, and my belief in liberty and justice was the force that would propel me forward. My initial steps in politics were cautious, but as the colonists' struggles against British oppression grew more intense, so did my commitment to their cause. I would soon find myself at the heart of a larger national movement that would culminate in the birth of a new nation, a nation based on the principles I had long studied: liberty, equality, and self-governance. When I was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1767, it was not just a political honor. It was the beginning of my public commitment to resist the British Crown's growing overreach. The Virginia House of Burgesses was a forum for colonial leaders to discuss their grievances with Britain, and it became the epicenter of my early political activity. The debates in that chamber were not simply theoretical discussions. They were the first skirmishes in the ideological battle that would lead to the American Revolution. The immediate issue before us was the question of taxation. In 1765, the British Parliament had imposed the Stamp Act, which placed taxes on paper products, including newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. This direct tax was levied without colonial representation, and many of us in the colonies believed it was a violation of our rights as Englishmen. I quickly became a vocal critic of British policies, drawing on my education in Enlightenment thought to argue that taxation without representation was not only unjust, it was tyrannical. In 1769, I wrote Summary View of the Rights of British America, a pamphlet that articulated the fundamental beliefs I had developed about the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. In it, I argued that the colonies were not merely subjects of the Crown, but autonomous entities with the right to govern themselves. I called for the colonies to unite in resistance to British policies, declaring that only through collective action could we defend our liberty. The pamphlet was widely circulated and helped solidify my position as an outspoken advocate for American independence. The early 1770s were a time of deepening unrest. In response to the British government's oppressive measures, I was appointed to the Virginia Committee of Correspondence in 1773. The Committees of Correspondence were a vital part of the colonial resistance effort, serving as informal networks of communication between the colonies. They allowed us to share intelligence, coordinate protests, and foster a sense of unity across the 13 colonies. This was the first real step toward forming a united colonial front, and I threw myself into this effort with full determination. The situation grew increasingly dire with the passage of the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, in 1774, which were aimed at punishing Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. These acts further united the colonies, and the Committees of Correspondence played a central role in organizing resistance. I worked tirelessly to ensure that Virginia was not left behind in the growing movement, helping to organize the First Continental Congress and promoting the idea of a common cause among the colonies. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774, and I was honored to be chosen as a delegate from Virginia. This was a critical turning point in my political journey. We, as delegates, were no longer just discussing grievances with Britain. We were discussing the future of our relationship with the Crown and whether we could ever remain under British rule. For the first time, I felt the weight of history on my shoulders, knowing that the decisions we made in this room could change the course of the future. In the Congress, we debated various courses of action, including boycotting British goods and establishing local militias to defend the colonies against British encroachment. The Congress served as a political awakening for me, as it became increasingly clear that we were no longer fighting for mere reform or redress of grievances. We were fighting for something far more profound: our right to self-determination and the creation of a government that would respect the natural rights of individuals. As tensions with Britain continued to mount, and after the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 marked the first shots of the Revolutionary War, it became evident that the time for negotiation had passed. The colonies were now at war with Britain, and we were in the process of forming a new nation, one that would not be ruled by a distant monarch, but by the will of the people. It was during the Second Continental Congress, in June 1776, that I was appointed to the committee tasked with drafting a declaration to explain our decision to break with Britain. The Declaration of Independence was, without a doubt, the most important document I would ever write. In that document, I was not merely stating the colonies' grievances. I was asserting the fundamental principles of liberty and justice that I had long believed in. Drawing heavily from the writings of Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers, I argued that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were not just lofty ideals. They were the principles that should guide every nation and every society. The drafting process was intense. There were numerous revisions and disagreements, but in the end, we produced a document that would forever change the world. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, formally severing ties with Great Britain and proclaiming the United States of America as a free and independent nation. The signing of the Declaration marked the beginning of a long and difficult war. The Revolutionary War would not be an easy or quick fight. I served as a diplomat in France, helping to secure crucial foreign aid for the American cause. My time in France was marked by political negotiation and diplomacy, and it was here that I formed a lifelong friendship with the Marquis de Lafayette, who would later play a crucial role in the American victory. In addition to my diplomatic work, I also served as the governor of Virginia during the war. As governor, I was responsible for managing the state's affairs, organizing military resistance, and supporting the American war effort. Though my time as governor was not without its challenges and setbacks, it allowed me to play a significant role in supporting the revolution on the home front as the Revolutionary War raged on. I was deeply involved in shaping the course of the new nation. The events of the 1770s were transformative, not only for me personally, but for the entire nation. The revolution had been sparked by a desire for liberty, but it was more than just a rebellion. It was a fight for the future of a nation built on the principles of justice and equality. Looking back, I realized that my early political career was not just about resistance to British tyranny. It was about something more profound, the creation of a new kind of government, one that would be based on the consent of the governed and the protection of natural rights. The road to independence was long and fraught with difficulty, but it was a road worth traveling, for it led to the birth of a new nation, one that would embody the ideals I had fought for my entire life. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the world changed forever. No longer simply a collection of rebellious colonies, the United States was now a nation in the making, and our struggle for liberty was far from over. The revolution would demand not only military fortitude but also diplomatic skill, governance, and deep philosophical consideration. As I moved from my role as an active member of the Continental Congress to an ambassador in Europe and eventually as governor of Virginia, my understanding of the nature of republics, diplomacy, and governance deepened. These years were foundational in shaping my vision for the United States as a republic founded on principles of liberty, equality, and the rule of law. Through diplomacy, governance, and the challenges of building a new nation, I came to appreciate the delicate balance between power and freedom, a theme that would guide me for the rest of my political career as the Revolutionary War began to unfold. It was clear that the American colonies needed more than just a military strategy to secure victory against Britain. They needed powerful allies. The outcome of the war rested not just on American arms, but also on our ability to secure financial, military, and diplomatic support. The most promising ally was France, whose resentment against British dominance in Europe made them an ideal partner. In 1781, I was appointed as the United States Minister to France, tasked with formalizing a relationship between the fledgling nation and the French monarchy. France had already provided unofficial assistance, but now it was crucial to secure a more substantial commitment. My mission was to persuade the French government to commit to supporting us both militarily and financially, understanding that without their help, our revolution could collapse. Living in Paris was a challenge for me, not only due to the linguistic and cultural differences, but also because of the intricacies of French politics. The French court was filled with intrigue, and King Louis XVI and his ministers were hesitant to openly back the American cause. Yet, I felt a deep sense of duty and urgency in my role. I knew that the French had the power to tilt the balance of the war, and my diplomatic efforts would be crucial in ensuring that the United States survived long enough to emerge as a republic. That I worked tirelessly to foster relationships with key figures such as the French Foreign Minister, Vergennes, and the Marquis de Lafayette, who had already committed to the American cause and became an invaluable asset. Through a combination of diplomatic negotiations and personal persuasion, I was able to secure military and financial assistance that would ultimately turn the tide of the war. The French Navy played a decisive role in the Battle of Yorktown, trapping the British Army under Cornwallis and forcing their surrender. Beyond military aid, I secured loans and supplies for the Continental Army, which were critical in keeping the American forces in the field. The French also provided critical support in the form of supplies for the nascent American economy, which was struggling under the weight of war. My time in France, although fraught with difficulty, proved invaluable, as the French intervention was a key factor in our eventual victory. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, bringing an official end to the war, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and accomplishment. The French had proved to be indispensable allies, and the treaty not only acknowledged the United States as an independent nation, but also set the boundaries of the new republic from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. The United States, once a cluster of rebellious colonies, was now a sovereign nation. But the peace treaty also presented new challenges. My experiences in Paris taught me that diplomacy was not simply about winning battles. It was about navigating complex relationships between nations. The Treaty of Paris, while a triumph, also highlighted the difficulties of securing lasting peace. Britain was hesitant to fully acknowledge the new nation's sovereignty, and the treaty terms were contentious. Much of my work, both in Paris and upon my return to America, was focused on managing these diplomatic complexities and ensuring that the terms of peace were fully honored. This would be a crucial part of my later work as Secretary of State. After returning to America in 1784, I was called to serve as governor of Virginia, a role that would prove to be as fraught with challenges as it was rewarding. At this time, Virginia was a state struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of war. The Revolutionary War had drained its resources, disrupted its economy, and left its borders vulnerable to British interference. As governor, I faced several immediate issues. The western frontier, in particular, was a flashpoint of tension. British-supported Native American tribes were attacking American settlements along the Ohio River. Furthermore, there were persistent concerns that British loyalists might attempt to destabilize the newly formed states. Managing this volatile situation while ensuring the state's interests were protected required deft political maneuvering and careful decision-making. Despite my best efforts to stabilize the state, my time as governor was marked by political infighting and dissatisfaction. The economy was in shambles, and the state's financial situation was dire. I pushed for reforms to streamline Virginia's government, but the entrenched political elites were resistant to change. Although I worked to strengthen the state's defenses and revitalize its economy, I was eventually unable to secure re-election in 1786, which was a significant personal disappointment. Nonetheless, my time as governor gave me invaluable insights into the practical challenges of governance. I saw firsthand how a weak central government could hinder the ability of states to function effectively, which deepened my growing conviction that the Articles of Confederation, the governing framework of the time, were insufficient. The inability of the central government to act decisively in crises was becoming increasingly apparent, and I began to believe that the creation of a stronger federal system was necessary to ensure the survival of the republic. My experiences as a diplomat and governor, along with my study of political theory, shaped my evolving vision for the United States. I believe that the American Republic must be founded on principles of liberty, equality, and democratic participation. However, I also came to realize that a purely democratic system, one in which decisions were made solely by majority rule, could lead to instability and mob rule. In particular, I feared that without checks on power, the government might become as tyrannical as the monarchy we had just overthrown. I also began to appreciate the need for a balance between federal and state powers. While I had strong reservations about centralizing too much authority in a federal government, I also understood that a weak central authority was no longer viable. The Articles of Confederation, which governed the United States in its early years, left too much power in the hands of the states and failed to provide a coherent structure for national defense or economic stability. At the same time, I was deeply committed to the idea of republicanism, the belief that government must derive its power from the consent of the governed. I argued that a republic, in which leaders are elected and held accountable to the people, was the only form of government that could safeguard individual liberties and ensure the common good. In the years following my time as governor, the flaws of the Articles of Confederation became increasingly apparent. The inability of Congress to raise revenue, the lack of a national military, and the economic turmoil caused by the inability of the central government to regulate trade all pointed to the need for reform. By 1787, it became clear that a new framework for governance was necessary to secure the future of the Republic. Although I was not directly involved in the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, having returned to Virginia, I was closely aligned with the intellectual and political forces pushing for constitutional reform. I believed that a stronger central government was needed to manage national affairs, but I also feared that too much centralization could threaten the liberties we had fought so hard to secure. These fears would continue to shape my political philosophy, especially as I engaged in the debates surrounding the ratification of the Constitution. As I reflect on my years as a diplomat, governor, and political theorist, I see how these experiences not only shaped my own political development, but also helped define the course of the American Republic. The struggles of the Revolution, the diplomatic victories in France, the challenges of governance in Virginia, and my growing commitment to republicanism all pointed toward the creation of a government that could balance liberty and order. The challenges of the 1780s, while daunting, were the crucible in which the United States was forged. They highlighted the flaws in our early system and set the stage for the Constitutional Convention of 1787, a convention that would seek to rectify those flaws and create a government capable of preserving the Republic for future generations. The work that I began during these early years, defending liberty, advocating for the common good, and seeking a more perfect union, would continue to guide me as I moved into the next chapter of my public life, the struggle for the formation of a government, based on the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. By the summer of 1787, the United States was faced with a decision that would determine its future. How could a young nation, born out of rebellion against tyranny, create a government strong enough to survive, but not so powerful that it would become the very tyranny it sought to escape? After a decade of struggles under the Articles of Confederation, it was clear that the existing government was failing to provide the necessary framework for the nation's survival and prosperity. The lack of unity, economic stability, and political coherence was palpable, and it was this very instability that led to the call for the Constitutional Convention. I, though absent in Paris serving as the American minister to France, was deeply involved through letters with my close ally, James Madison, and others who sought to reshape the future of the country. The Constitutional Convention would address the crisis, balancing the need for strong federal authority with the preservation of individual liberties and state rights, a balancing act that would shape my own vision for the future of the United States. The Articles of Confederation, which served as the first Constitution of the United States, had been crafted in the heat of the Revolutionary War, when unity was paramount. However, the reality of a new republic was vastly different than the idealism that shaped the Articles. While they were designed to preserve the sovereignty of the states, the Articles failed to provide a central authority with sufficient powers to regulate trade, raise revenue, or manage conflicts between states. This left the nation struggling with economic disarray, states engaging in trade wars, and a lack of national unity. The inability of the central government to impose taxes meant that the national government was constantly in debt, unable to fund the military or even pay soldiers who had fought in the Revolution. Moreover, the economic troubles of the post-war period, crippling debt, inflation, and a lack of effective currency, exacerbated the situation. With the country on the brink of collapse, it became clear that the Articles needed to be either drastically amended or completely replaced. But this raised a central question. How could a new constitution be formed that would not sacrifice the very liberties and freedoms Americans had fought so hard to secure? The Constitutional Convention convened in May 1787 in Philadelphia with 12 states in attendance. Although I was not physically present, my influence was felt through the writings and ideas I shared with Madison and other delegates. My concern was not just for the immediate needs of the country, but for its long-term survival. The question of whether the United States could thrive under a government that both respected individual freedoms and provided the necessary power for national unity was at the heart of the debates. The convention's work was fraught with disagreements. Delegates were divided between those advocating for a strong centralized government and those who feared such power would lead to a monarchy or another form of tyranny. The larger states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, favored a system that would give them more power, while smaller states such as New Jersey feared that they would be left without a voice in the federal system. This debate would ultimately lead to the creation of the Virginia Plan, written by Madison, which proposed a bicameral legislature with representation based on population. While this plan favored larger states, smaller states rejected it. In response, William Paterson of New Jersey introduced the New Jersey Plan, which proposed equal representation for all states, regardless of size. This tension between the large and small states nearly derailed the convention. Yet, both sides understood the necessity of compromise. The breakthrough came in the form of the Great Compromise, a proposal crafted by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. The compromise combined elements from both the Virginia and New Jersey plans, resulting in the establishment of a bicameral legislature with two houses: the House of Representatives, where representation would be based on population, and the Senate, where each state would have equal representation. This balanced the interests of both the large and small states, creating a framework for federal governance that could ensure fair representation for all. Though this compromise was a significant achievement, it was not without challenges. The debate over representation revealed a deeper conflict. How could a nation, founded on the ideals of liberty and equality, reconcile its democratic principles with the reality of slavery, which existed predominantly in the southern states? Slavery, an institution deeply entrenched in the southern economy, loomed large in the discussions of the new government. The question of whether slaves should be counted in determining representation was a central point of contention. Southern states, where slavery was integral to the economy, insisted that slaves should be counted as part of the population, as it would give them more political power in the House of Representatives. Conversely, northern states, where slavery was less widespread, argued that slaves, as property without rights, should not be counted. The resulting 3/5 compromise agreed that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. While this compromise was crucial to securing Southern states' support for the new Constitution, it also institutionalized the idea of inequality. The moral stain of slavery would continue to haunt the country, leading to decades of conflict, culminating in the Civil War. One of the most contentious aspects of the Constitutional Convention was the creation of the executive branch. The framers were determined to avoid a tyrant, as they had seen in King George III. The question was not just what powers the president would have, but how to prevent the president from gaining too much authority. Madison and Hamilton argued for a strong executive, capable of enforcing the laws and acting decisively in times of crisis. But others, including my own views, remained cautious about the dangers of centralizing too much power. The solution was to create a presidency with significant authority, but with clear limitations. The president would be elected indirectly through the Electoral College to balance the influence of states and the people. The president would serve a 4-year term, with the possibility of re-election and the power to veto congressional legislation, though subject to a 2/3 override by Congress. The establishment of the presidency thus created a central figure of authority, while the system of checks and balances ensured that no one branch could dominate the others. Though the Constitution itself was a remarkable document, one of the most contentious debates was over the absence of a Bill of Rights. Many, including myself, feared that without explicit protections for individual freedoms, the new government could easily infringe upon the liberties we had fought to protect during the Revolution. I advocated for a Bill of Rights, believing that explicit protections for freedom of speech, the press, and religion, as well as protections against unreasonable search and seizure and cruel and unusual punishment, were necessary to ensure the Republic's survival. However, many of the framers, including Madison, believed that the Constitution itself already contained sufficient safeguards against tyranny and that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. Despite this opposition, the promise of adding a Bill of Rights played a crucial role in securing ratification, and I was pleased when the first Congress passed 10 amendments that would become the Bill of Rights in 1791. Once the Constitution was drafted, it was time to take it to the states for ratification. The debates were fierce. The Federalists, led by figures like Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, argued that the Constitution was essential for the survival and prosperity of the nation. They believed that a strong central government was necessary to ensure national unity and stability. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, feared that the new government would be too powerful and would erode the rights of individuals and states. They worried that the president would become a monarch and that the central government would infringe upon the sovereignty of the states. Though deeply committed to the principles of a republican government, I found myself in agreement with the Anti-Federalists, particularly regarding the absence of a Bill of Rights. In a letter to Madison, I expressed my concerns about the potential for the new government to become tyrannical and my belief that it was essential to safeguard the freedoms of the people. Ultimately, the promise of the Bill of Rights secured the necessary support for ratification, and by 1789, the Constitution had been adopted. The Constitution of the United States is a remarkable document, one that has endured for over 2 centuries. The debates, compromises, and ideals that shaped it reflect the complexities of creating a government that would balance liberty with order, freedom with authority. As I look back on the convention and the debates that led to the adoption of the Constitution, I am struck by how deeply the nation's future was shaped by those few months in Philadelphia. Though imperfect, the Constitution provided a framework for governance that respected the ideals of republicanism, balanced powers between the federal government and the states, and, ultimately, ensured the survival of the United States as a republic. In my own time, I believe that the Constitution, though far from perfect, was the best possible solution for preserving liberty while providing the necessary structure for national unity. The early years of the United States, under the framework of the newly ratified Constitution, were defined by experimentation, struggles for identity, and the creation of precedents that would set the tone for centuries. The presidency of George Washington, though revered as a time of national unity, was also the birthplace of deep political divisions that would inevitably lead to the rise of the two-party system. As Washington's Secretary of State, I had the privilege, and at times the burden, of being at the heart of these divisions. Though Washington attempted to keep the new government above political factions, ideological differences between figures such as myself and Alexander Hamilton could not be avoided. These divisions weren't just political. They were philosophical, rooted in our contrasting views on the nature of government, liberty, and power. In this chapter, I reflect on Washington's leadership, the formation of political factions, and the conflicts that would shape the future trajectory of the United States. When George Washington assumed the presidency in 1789, he faced not only the task of leading a new nation, but also the responsibility of defining the presidency itself. There was no blueprint, no tradition to fall back on, and no institutional memory to guide him. Washington was the first to occupy the office, and every action he took would become a precedent for future leaders. Washington understood the gravity of the moment, and his careful, deliberate actions during his presidency reflected his belief in the importance of stability and unity. He formed a cabinet, a concept that did not exist under the Articles of Confederation, and appointed individuals of great experience and varying viewpoints. It was a pragmatic choice that would ensure the fledgling government would function. However, it also set the stage for the political rift between those who championed a strong central government and those who feared an overreaching federal authority. That Washington's steadfast commitment to national unity was visible in his administration's domestic policies, but perhaps more so in his foreign policy. Washington's policy of neutrality, especially in the face of European conflicts, marked his belief that the United States should avoid foreign entanglements at all costs. His proclamation of neutrality in 1793 made it clear that the United States would not take sides in the ongoing war between Britain and France. Though Washington's actions were largely measured, his presidency was far from politically tranquil. In fact, Washington's restraint and caution in many respects set the stage for my growing political rivalry with Alexander Hamilton, which would lead to the formation of the nation's first political parties. Washington's vision for a unified country without political factions quickly unraveled as fundamental ideological differences emerged between key members of his cabinet. At the heart of these divisions were two men, Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and myself, the Secretary of State. We shared a common goal, the survival and prosperity of the United States. However, our approaches to governance, the role of the federal government, and the future of the nation could not have been more different. Hamilton's vision. A strong federal government. Hamilton's vision for the United States was grounded in the idea of a strong central government with the power to shape the nation's economic and political future. His program focused on creating a robust financial system, securing foreign credit, and promoting industrial development. He believed in a national bank, a strong military, and a system that allowed for significant federal intervention in the economy. His policies, especially the establishment of the first bank of the United States, were aimed at stabilizing the fledgling nation's finances and attracting foreign investment. Hamilton's idea of centralization was deeply rooted in his belief that a strong federal government was essential to prevent chaos and disunion. He saw the federal government as a protector of order and economic development, believing that without strong institutions, the United States could descend into disorder and anarchy. His vision was fundamentally tied to a pro-business, pro-British orientation, believing that an alliance with Great Britain, then the world's most powerful economic and military power, was vital for the survival and growth of the young republic. In stark contrast, I believed in a more decentralized government that would allow for greater autonomy for the states. I was a firm believer in the power of the people and in agrarianism, the idea that an economy based on farming, rather than industrialization, would best preserve liberty and independence. I saw the self-sufficiency of farmers as the backbone of American freedom, and I feared that a powerful federal government, too close to the interests of the wealthy elite, would eventually suppress the freedoms of ordinary citizens. I viewed Hamilton's push for a national bank as an overreach, giving too much power to the federal government and potentially exploiting the common people. I also believed that any relationship with Britain would entangle us in their imperialist interests and undermine our sovereignty. My vision for the United States was one of democratic agrarianism, where states retained significant power and the federal government would have a limited role, primarily to protect individual liberties and ensure the safety of the republic. The division between Hamilton and myself led to the formation of political factions, which, though never intended, became the bedrock of the American political system. While Hamilton led the Federalists, advocating for a strong central government, I led the Republicans, later known as the Democratic Republicans, advocating for states' rights, agrarianism, and a limited federal government. This division was not just political, it was ideological, a reflection of our differing views on the proper role of government. Hamilton's Federalists supported a strong executive and the centralization of power, while my Republicans sought to preserve a republic where the federal government was kept in check by the states and the people. These differing visions set the stage for a political rivalry that would shape American politics for years to come. The Federalists and Republicans began to emerge not only as rival factions, but as foundational political parties, each with distinct positions on governance, foreign policy, and the economy. One of the first significant tests of the new government came with the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, which tested the authority of the federal government to enforce its laws. The rebellion was sparked by an excise tax on whiskey, which disproportionately affected small farmers, many of whom distilled whiskey as a way of getting value out of surplus grain. While Hamilton saw the rebellion as an opportunity to assert the authority of the federal government, I viewed it as a demonstration of the disconnect between the government and ordinary people. I supported Washington's decision to put down the rebellion, recognizing the necessity of maintaining order. However, it also exposed the tension between federal authority and the growing sentiment among ordinary citizens that their interests were being sidelined by the elites in power. This event illustrated how fragile the early republic was and how easy it could have been to slip into a system where the government, unchecked, could overpower the will of the people. It was a poignant reminder that liberty could only be preserved if the government remained true to the values of republicanism and not those of monarchy or tyranny. The question of foreign policy further deepened the divide between Hamilton and myself. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 posed a significant challenge for the United States, particularly in the wake of our own revolution. The French, who had aided us during the American Revolution, now found themselves embroiled in a violent revolution of their own. Hamilton believed that the United States should align itself with Britain, seeing Britain as a vital trading partner. He feared that supporting France would lead the U.S. into a destructive war, especially since the revolution had grown increasingly radical. I, on the other hand, saw the French Revolution as a continuation of the struggle for liberty and independence, and I wanted to support France, as they had supported us during our War of Independence. Washington's decision to follow a policy of neutrality in 1793, articulated in the Proclamation of Neutrality, was a direct result of the division between Hamilton and myself. While I favored honoring our obligations to France, Washington ultimately sided with Hamilton, fearing that any direct involvement in the European conflict would undermine the fragile unity of the United States. As Washington prepared to step down from the presidency, the election of 1796 was the first presidential election in which political parties were fully formed. The Federalists nominated John Adams, while the Republicans nominated me. The election was marked by fierce rhetoric and growing animosity between the two factions. Though I did not win, and Adams became the second president, the election was a landmark moment in the history of American politics. It marked the formal division of the country into political factions, and the rivalry between the Federalists and Republicans would dominate American political life for decades to come. The first years of the new republic were marked by tremendous challenges, both internal and external. George Washington's presidency, despite his best efforts to maintain unity, was the crucible in which the first political divisions took shape. Hamilton and I may have disagreed on nearly every issue, but we both shared the belief that the success of the United States depended on a commitment to Republican principles and the survival of the Union. The election of 1800 was, in many ways, the culmination of the struggles that had defined the early years of the United States. For years, a fierce ideological battle raged between the Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, and the Republicans, with me at their helm. This contest was not merely about who would occupy the White House, but about what direction the nation would take. Would it remain under the heavy hand of centralized authority, or would it embrace the vision of a government that was more democratic, more responsive to the will of the people, and more decentralized? As I took office in March 1801, the implications of the election were enormous, not only for the future of the country, but also for the very identity of the United States. What transpired was not just a transfer of political power, but a momentous shift in the country's political and philosophical direction, one that set the United States on a path towards a new era of governance and ideological battles. The so-called Revolution of 1800 was not only a victory for me and the Republican cause, but it also symbolized the deepening commitment to democratic principles, self-governance, and a republic where liberty would always be safeguarded. By the time the election of 1800 arrived, the Federalist Party, which had dominated the political landscape of the early republic, was on the decline. The Federalists, led by John Adams, had set the tone for the nation's early policies, but their vision of a strong, centralized government was increasingly seen as out of touch with the needs and desires of a growing and diversifying nation. Many of the Federalist policies, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited free speech and suppressed political dissent, had enraged large segments of the American populace. The acts, which were passed in 1798 in response to fears of foreign influence and internal dissent, had been particularly controversial. They allowed the government to imprison or deport immigrants deemed dangerous and made it illegal to criticize the government in print. For me and many of my fellow Republicans, these acts represented an unacceptable overreach of federal power, violating the very principles of liberty that the Revolution had fought to uphold. Moreover, the Federalists' pro-British foreign policy, which sought to maintain strong economic ties with Great Britain, was seen as an attempt to align the United States too closely with an imperial power. This was particularly unacceptable given the experience of the Revolution and the desire to preserve American independence from foreign influence. As the 1800 election approached, the Federalists found themselves increasingly isolated. The economic difficulties facing the nation, combined with growing public dissatisfaction with Federalist overreach, made it clear that the old guard of Hamiltonian policies had lost their appeal. The Federalist Party's control of the government had eroded, and many of its leaders, including Alexander Hamilton, whose ideological influence had been monumental, were becoming less relevant in the eyes of the American people. In stark contrast, my Republican vision for America was grounded in the belief that the federal government should be limited and that political power should be decentralized, leaving more authority to the states and the people. My goal was to return the government to the hands of ordinary citizens, ensuring that the federal government would serve the people's needs rather than those of the elite. This vision, I believed, would foster a nation where agrarianism was central to its identity. I argued that farmers, the backbone of the nation's economy, were best suited to uphold the values of liberty and self-sufficiency. A strong, central government, I feared, would erode the autonomy of these citizens, leading to tyranny and corruption. This vision was also shaped by my belief in republicanism, not in the partisan sense that we understand today, but in the sense of a government that placed the public good above private interests. This meant that policies should focus on maintaining civil liberties, reducing unnecessary government intervention, and curtailing the influence of the wealthy elite. We sought a society where power was decentralized and kept in check, one where ordinary citizens had the ability to control their own destinies, whether they were farmers, merchants, or artisans. The election of 1800 was a contest of two radically different visions of the American future, one that sought to continue the Federalist ideals of centralization and aristocracy, and one that championed liberty, equality, and the empowerment of ordinary citizens. The campaign leading up to the 1800 election was one of the most bitter and divisive in American history. Both sides engaged in fierce political warfare, with newspapers playing a central role in shaping public opinion. The Federalist press used every opportunity to attack me and my Republican allies, calling us radicals and accusing us of plotting to destroy the fabric of American society. They claimed that I was an atheist, a dangerous libertine who sought to dismantle the moral order of the nation. These attacks, though often exaggerated, tapped into fears about my political philosophy and the potential instability it might bring. That, on the other hand, the Republican press went after Adams and his Federalist colleagues with equal ferocity. We painted Adams as a monarchist, a man who had tried to silence free speech and who was too closely aligned with Britain. We used the Alien and Sedition Acts as evidence of Federalist tyranny, accusing Adams and his party of infringing upon the rights of ordinary Americans. Despite the personal animosities, the election of 1800 was ultimately about the broader ideological divide between the two factions. While the Federalists had the backing of the Northeastern elites and business interests, we Republicans were able to connect with the rural and Western population who were disillusioned with the Federalist vision of a centralized, elitist government. The election of 1800, however, was not decided in the way most had expected. Because of the structure of the Electoral College, which initially did not distinguish between votes for president and vice president, Aaron Burr and I received the same number of electoral votes, 73. This created a standoff, where neither one of us had a clear majority. Under the Constitution, the election would now be decided by the House of Representatives, where each state delegation would cast a single vote. The election had been hotly contested, and many Federalist delegates, still loyal to Adams, sought to block my election and elect Burr, whom they saw as less of a threat to their interests. This constitutional crisis created uncertainty in the nation, and for days, the House remained deadlocked. The resolution to this standoff came after intense political maneuvering, particularly by Alexander Hamilton, who, despite his animosity toward me, ultimately threw his support behind me. He saw Burr as a more dangerous figure, one who lacked the philosophical grounding necessary to guide the nation. Through a series of political negotiations and the persuasion of key figures, I was elected as the third president of the United States after the 36th ballot in the House. The outcome of the election of 1800 marked a pivotal moment in American history. Not only did it demonstrate the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, but it also showed that the principles of democracy, even in their infancy, were strong enough to endure a crisis without violence. The election of 1800 is often referred to as the Revolution of 1800 because it represented a profound shift in the political direction of the United States. It was a revolution not of arms, but of ideas. The triumph of the Republican Party over the Federalists symbolized a rejection of centralized authority in favor of a more democratic, decentralized system. It was a moment when the principles of the American Revolution, liberty, equality, and the rejection of monarchy, were reaffirmed in the political realm. The peaceful transfer of power was an extraordinary achievement. It was a testament to the strength of American institutions and to the resilience of the nation's commitment to democracy. As I assumed the presidency, I was acutely aware of the weight of this moment, knowing that the success of our democratic experiment hinged not just on winning the election, but on ensuring that the will of the people would always be respected, no matter how contentious the process might be. With the election behind me, the focus turned to governance. The policies I implemented during my presidency were grounded in the vision I had long advocated: a government that would leave people to govern themselves as much as possible, and that would reduce the power of centralized authority. This meant reducing the national debt, cutting taxes, downsizing the military, and eliminating unnecessary federal institutions. My administration also worked to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, which I viewed as an infringement on civil liberties. That a major challenge of my presidency was finding the balance between these principles and the reality of governing a growing nation. While I championed limited government, I also recognized that some level of central authority was necessary for the nation's survival, particularly in foreign policy and national defense. This tension would define much of my presidency and would continue to shape the political landscape of the United States. The election of 1800 was a defining moment in the history of the United States. It was not just a contest for political power, but a referendum on the very principles of the American Republic. The peaceful transfer of power, the victory of Republican ideals over. On April 30th, 1803, the United States signed the historic Louisiana Purchase Treaty, which fundamentally altered the course of American history. This decision not only expanded America's territory, but also set the stage for the nation's emergence as a continental power. While this bold diplomatic move was initially seen as a risky gamble, today it stands as one of the greatest achievements of my presidency and a pivotal moment in America's rise to global prominence. In this chapter, I will explore the historical context, political and social changes resulting from the purchase, and how it shaped America's future. Before the Louisiana Purchase, the Louisiana Territory had passed through several hands. Initially controlled by Spain, the region was later restored to French control under Napoleon Bonaparte's leadership. Napoleon sought to revive French imperial power in the New World, especially in the Caribbean and Louisiana. However, his plans to establish a French empire in the Americas were not immediately realized, and this ambition created a deep concern for the United States. The French control of Louisiana was a significant threat. New Orleans, at the mouth of the Mississippi River, was a key port for trade in the western U.S., and its strategic location was essential for the entire western economy. For farmers in Tennessee, Kentucky, and other frontier states, New Orleans was more than just a port. It was the lifeblood of their economy. If France regained control of the port, the U.S. would lose its ability to trade freely, and Western settlers would be severely impacted. Therefore, securing New Orleans was an essential goal for the U.S. government. If France controlled this vital area, the United States would not only lose its Western trade access, but also face the prospect of renewed conflict with European powers. Faced with this looming threat, I took immediate diplomatic action. In 1802, I sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to Paris to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and its surrounding areas. Our initial goal was to secure the port, but the situation soon evolved into an opportunity to acquire the entire Louisiana Territory. The success of this purchase was largely due to Napoleon's miscalculations and France's changing strategic priorities. Napoleon, burdened by war in Europe, difficulties with Britain at sea, and the collapse of his colonial ambitions in Haiti, needed funds to finance his military campaigns. Faced with these pressures, he offered to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. This agreement, signed on April 30th, 1803, was nothing short of extraordinary. For just $15 million, the U.S. acquired approximately 828,000 square miles of land, nearly 3 times the size of the nation at the time. The territory stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, greatly expanding the United States landmass. The Louisiana Purchase was not just a land deal. It was a transformative event for the United States, reshaping its geographic and strategic position. The acquisition provided the U.S. with enormous land resources that would fuel its agricultural economy, expand its military reach, and open up new opportunities for settlement and trade. Agriculture and economic growth. The newly acquired lands provided vast fertile soil, particularly beneficial for America's agrarian economy. With land for crops like cotton, tobacco, and other staples, the southern and western states flourished. New settlers moved westward, bringing new agricultural developments and enhancing the nation's economic growth. Trade and transportation. New Orleans, the central port at the mouth of the Mississippi, was not just a port but a key economic hub for the entire Mississippi River Valley. With control over New Orleans, the United States gained unrestricted access to international markets and trade routes. This freedom of trade was crucial for agricultural producers in the western states, ensuring that their products could reach international markets. Military and strategic advantage. The strategic importance of this acquisition cannot be overstated. By securing Louisiana, the United States strengthened its defense capabilities against any European power that might seek to reclaim territory in the Americas. Controlling this land allowed the U.S. to create a defensive buffer against potential invasions and maintain a stronger position in North America. Despite the numerous benefits of the Louisiana Purchase, the agreement was not without constitutional controversy. The Constitution did not explicitly authorize the federal government to purchase foreign territory, and many of my critics, especially Federalists, argued that I had overstepped my powers. They believed that such a significant territorial acquisition was outside the scope of executive authority, as it was not directly authorized in the Constitution. In response to these concerns, I defended the decision on the grounds of national interest. I argued that as president, it was my duty to ensure the survival and prosperity of the nation, and the Louisiana Purchase was a strategic move necessary to secure the United States' future. I believe that the expansion of territory, for the sake of national security and economic growth, was not only justified but essential for the country's continued success. Furthermore, I argued that while the Constitution did not explicitly mention such land acquisitions, the broader purpose of the Constitution was to promote the general welfare and ensure the security of the nation. The Louisiana Purchase aligned with those objectives and was consistent with the country's foundational principles. The Louisiana Purchase set the stage for the westward expansion of the United States, often referred to as the Manifest Destiny era, where Americans believed they were destined to expand across the continent. The newly acquired land provided an opportunity for millions of settlers to move westward, settle on new lands, and establish communities. This migration and expansion would continue throughout the 19th century, pushing the boundaries of American society. However, this expansion brought new political and social challenges, particularly concerning the issue of slavery. As new territories were acquired, the question arose whether slavery would be allowed in these areas. This issue would escalate over the coming decades, leading to political conflict and eventually contributing to the outbreak of the Civil War. The expansion of slavery into the new territories became one of the most divisive issues in American politics. Moreover, as settlers pushed westward, they encountered Native American tribes, whose land was increasingly encroached upon. The displacement of Native American communities, often through force, was a dark chapter in the nation's expansionist history. Looking back on the Louisiana Purchase, it is clear that this decision had profound and lasting effects on the United States. The acquisition of this vast territory ensured that America would have the resources to become a major agricultural and industrial power in the 19th century. It provided a foundation for the nation's economic growth, expanded national security, and gave America access to some of the world's richest natural resources. While the decision was controversial at the time, today, it is regarded as one of the most successful and far-sighted acts in American history. The purchase not only extended the nation's borders, but also set the stage for America's growth into a continental power with a strong agricultural base, strategic advantages, and economic prosperity. The Louisiana Purchase was a defining moment in American history, helping to secure the future of the nation and affirming the principles of expansion and self-determination that would guide the country throughout the 19th century. In my view, this was a moment where the United States reached toward its destiny, and in doing so, forged a future that would see it grow from a fledgling nation to a global power. The Louisiana Purchase was, indeed, one of the most significant decisions of my presidency, and its impact on the trajectory of the United States cannot be overstated.